Hello and welcome. I am the Restless Kaiser and we are modelling for Advantage. Once again we're going to have another go at a painting video, and this time we're going to look at the WARCRY Scenery and how you can paint your WARCRY Scenery to the standard that I've done here. It's not beautiful, but it's certainly serviceable. It's going to look decent. It's going to be ready to play with. This project is huge. I've broken the video into two parts. The second part will look at the scatter terrain, the fences, the barricades, and the odd little bits here and there. This video, we're going to focus just on the buildings. As you can see from the stills, there's quite a lot of scenery here, and you probably want to break this project up into several stages. The first thing to do is to build this scenery really quite carefully. I put a link up there. Other YouTubers have done the work in arranging the buildings in a very specific way. You see, each of the terrain maps that come on the cards in WARCRY are going to require you to build the scenery in a specific way to be able to play with those decks. So once you've got the scenery built, and that's probably taken you quite a while, I took a £1 grey rattle can from the pound shop and sprayed the whole lot grey. Took it outside to do this, obviously. Be careful when spraying, but it's going to take you a while. You probably need to do it in stages. I used a grey because I'm planning to use washes to colour the scenery. Before we get to that stage though, it's important to try and bring out some of the highlights. Some people might call this underpainting. This is where the coats that you put on underneath are going to affect the top colour rather than highlighting afterwards. So the first thing I did was use Mechanicus Standard Grey, and I dry brushed a piece of the scenery all over with it. You can see from the still that this isn't necessarily providing the degree of highlight. When you're putting highlights on underneath the wash, you need a more extreme highlight. Certainly in the shadows, you're really not seeing any definition at all. So not satisfied with that, I took out the Celestra Grey and I dry brushed the whole lot again. This is a much lighter colour, a much more of a highlighting type colour, but it's going underneath the wash. I wanted a more extreme highlight. So we move on to actually applying the wash to the bulk of the stonework on this scenery, and I've used a Thonian camo shade. A Thonian camo shade isn't that bright a green, it's almost got a browny texture. I was looking for a kind of mouldy fish tank kind of look, to be honest, and so the Thonian camo shade has been applied all over the model. The only exception is the areas where I'm going to clearly be painting it a very different colour, such as all the timber work that's attached to the buildings and also the metal grills. You can see here that underpainting, that really extreme highlight that we put underneath with the dry brushing has really paid dividends when the wash starts to dry. We've got highlighting all over the stonework without having to apply additional layers of paint. If you want a slightly darker look, and I experimented with different types, you can apply that wash a second time. Some of the areas in you applying the wash are going to provide more difficulty than others, because remember that the staining of this grey through the wash is actually what's providing our colour. So when you look at areas such as the flagstones and the curbstones at the top, make sure that you've put that wash between all of the spaces. You've got it between the planks, the timber work and the stonework. Don't worry if you're staining some of the timber. We're going to paint that a different colour. When applying the wash to the large flat stones at the top of the buildings, you need to be a little bit careful. You don't want to get streaks or mottling, so you want it to go on really in one coat. Use a large flat brush and just draw it along carefully. Try not to go over it again with the brush. In doing so, you're likely to cause streaks or mottling. There's a very good chance in applying this wash all over the model that you've missed areas, especially as you've probably had to do it in more than one stage because you have to handle the model. As best as possible, try and fix this problem while it's wet. Do it in a very bright area, preferably outside if you can during the day, and look carefully in all of the cracks and the corners and the crevices and the underneaths and the tops of all the lintels. As you can see in some of these stills, I missed those areas. While that wash is still wet, apply a little bit more, move it around and really jab your brush into those corners. Try to use a brush that you don't particularly care about, because there'll be a fair bit of poking here. The staining is the colour. The colour must go everywhere or it will really stand out, and it will bug you forever that you've missed a bit. You can tidy it up afterwards, but because that staining is the colour, it's going to darken the other areas, and sometimes you get a bit of a line when you apply a wash a second time to a model where you've missed a bit. So try and do this at this stage. turn the model upside down, turn the model sideways, look at it from all angles, and this is the point when you really want to work with any pools that are developing. That's inevitable with a wash, that it runs down and it will gather up in spaces. Some of the areas that's likely to happen is in some of the detail work at the very tops of the walls and at the very bottoms of the walls, but also on the lintels and the sills. Some of that detail work at the top and the bottom will have been missed as you've gone over, or not quite covered, or not properly covered, and some of it will have pools in. So take your brush and give it a stab and move it around. While the wash is still wet, use the wash that's already there, if at all possible, without applying more, and just move it around so that you've got total coverage. Don't worry too much about the brickwork, because we're going to do something different with that. You may choose, having watched this video, that you don't like what I did with the brickwork, in which case just use the green wash here. Don't worry if the Athonian camo shade does cover it, but don't worry if it doesn't. That wash is going to take quite a long time to dry, so it's time to start working on a second piece, and you probably want to follow this process with this scenery. Get to one stage with one of the buildings, then start on another building, then start on a third building, then go back to the first one. Whatever works for you and however much time you're prepared to put in. But don't sit down and think, I'm going to do all of this in one go. I'm going to do all of the washes, then all of this, then all of that. Because the drying time is quite substantial, especially for that wash stage. And you don't want that wash mixing with any other colours while it's still wet. Starting with the brickwork then, this model is going to look very green, and generally with scenery you want it to be fairly bland. You want it to look painted and you want it to look okay, but you don't want to make it too striking. You don't want it to look better than your models in particular. So I looked at this and I thought, but it's still very, very green, so let's have a look at adding some colour, and there were various examples of this online, and I felt that the red brick look really works quite well. So where there are the areas of brickwork, take a much smaller brush and take out the corn red. And with the corn red, we're going to carefully paint this brickwork. I worked my way round the edges and then the middle, which meant I could keep it fairly neat. You want your paint to be quite runny here. You don't want to use it straight from the pot, because you want it to flow in the gaps between the bricks. This is going to take you quite a long time for this work, and you may decide that it's not necessary. For me, I liked it, but you may feel differently. Other colours may work here too. I just like the red. You might want to try it on these much smaller pieces, because if you don't like it, you can always go back, repaint that area with Mechanica Standard Grey, and then give it a dry brush of the Celestra Grey. So by this stage, you can go back to that first model, which the staining should have dried. We just took out the Rhinox hide now to paint in the timber work. Again, use the paint fairly thinly so that it spreads nicely between the cracks. Pay particular attention to the edges of the timber, which are a bit more jagged in construction. The paint may not take very well. You probably need to apply 2 coats of this. I used Rhinox hide for this because it's very dark, but you may prefer to use Dryad bark or any number of other browns. When painting the timber work, it's important to remember that this model cannot be seen from underneath. So don't paint it. You can certainly paint the edges because they can be seen, but I don't paint the underneath of things if I don't have to. And here's an example of one of the areas where you just don't need to do it. For completeness, if it troubles you, then of course. But as you can see, looking at the model from any battlefield position, you're not going to see that that area hadn't been. This is a big project and you want to cut corners wherever you can. Pay careful attention not to let any of that brown spill over onto the stonework, obviously, because it's very difficult to tidy up the stonework at this stage. With the base coat of that timber work drying, we move on to the metal grills. There are lots of different ways of doing this, of course, but the most straightforward one is to take the lead belcher straight from the pot, thin it down a little bit, and paint it straight on. You're going to be careful that you've not got any unpainted areas, particularly the flat sections between one side and the next, because you're likely to paint it on one side, turn it over, paint it the other, and the underside. So again, keep turning the model around as you paint the areas so that you're not missing anything. I would encourage you to work your way along one side, then turn it round and work your way along the other side. Then that way, if your paint is fairly thin, it should cover it entirely. But again, turn it upside down, turn it round, keep it moving, because you don't want to go back and do any of this again. Get it right first time. See, with the brush here again, it might help to paint with the inside of the squares with the side of the brush. As your paint is quite thin, be careful here that it doesn't flick at all, because that's likely to put metallic spots all over your stonework. So in the in-between times, it's worth going back to that stonework and having a look. With the corn red wash applied, it looks okay. It's certainly providing a level of visual interest to the model, but it isn't quite good enough. You could apply a wash of Agrax Earthshade, and I did try this, but I didn't feel it made a substantial difference. A lot of these areas are in shadow anyway. What really made a difference was highlighting it with a dry brush, and I used the Troll Slayer Orange, which is a very bright colour. If you're not familiar with dry brushing, I suppose it's worth taking a moment to explain how it works. Essentially, you want to leave the pigment on the brush and you want to take the liquid away, so that when you run the brush over a model, it only picks out the very, very highlighted areas, the topmost raised sections. This works very well on heavily textured surfaces such as this brickwork. If you're using Games Workshop layer paint, there's a translucence to this, which is really going to help blend with the colour underneath it. Although Troll Slayer Orange is very bright, it's also a little bit transparent. So it's not going to leave quite the effect that you want, certainly not with a single coat. So with a dry brush, you apply some black paint to the brush, and then you rub most of it off on a paper towel. You can see from mine here, as I've done this several times. You want to use a messy old brush, ideally that's flat or square at the end. You can take an old brush and just cut the tip off it, but this is going to help you control the areas where the dry brush is going to go. Apply it quite lightly at first, and then as the pigment starts to wear off on the brush, you can apply it more roughly. Just go up and down the brickwork with the Troll Slayer Orange, having wiped most of the paint off, and it's really going to make the texture pop. As it dries though, because of this translucence that I've referred to, wet paint is brighter. And you can see here one with and one without the highlight applied. It isn't as strong as you may have first suspected. If it was, it's probably too much. But once it's dried and it's toned down a little bit, you can see in these two contrasting pieces, it works quite nicely. Back to the timber then. So the plain Rhinox hide is quite dark, which was what we were looking for, but we want to bring out some of the detail. And there's a nice amount of detail on this scenery, which will take a dry brush very well. I went for the Mournfang Brown because it's got a bit of an orangey tint to it, but also because I wanted to distinguish the cut timber from the trees and branches that are part of the scatter terrain. So the Mournfang Brown is just a straight dry brush across, and that's really brought out those ridges. You probably need to do this twice. So going back to the metal grills, you can paint on any details that you want. You'll see here I've just painted on the lock with a Balthazar gold, but you might want to paint some of the reinforced fastenings on there. It really depends how much time you're prepared to put on this. But at this stage, with that dry, you now put on a wash. I used Agrax Earthshade, and I mixed a little bit of Reikland Flesh Shade and Sepia Wash in here and there, just to try and mix up the colours. But actually, in the end, as you can see from the still, it didn't really make that much difference. So if I was doing it again, I probably wouldn't bother and just go straight for the Agrax. The whole thing's trying to look ancient, so Agrax was the way to go. And again, you can see with that wash, the Agrax has really brought out all of the detail in the finish. So let's look at a more complicated piece of the scenery. We've talked about the basic buildings at this point, but the bell tower is a particular interest and has a few more details that requires a bit of attention. There are some steps that can be cut out here, like all the others. So we've begun with the same process. We've applied the Athonian Camo shade, and we've painted the timber work with the Rhinox hide. It's worth considering doing this in sub-assemblies. There are areas of, particularly around the ladder and the platform, where it was more difficult to paint them, and I had to be a lot more careful than I wanted to be, given the amount of time that it was taking to put the scenery together. I certainly wouldn't have connected the ladder. I would have superglued it on again afterwards if I was doing this again. When applying the Athonian Camo shade to the stonework on the bell tower, don't worry about covering the skeleton. Don't go out of your way to do it, but you do need to get the space behind it. You don't want any of that grey showing through. The kind of mixed bits of timber around the bottom of this that are holding up the structure can be a little bit more difficult to paint, so be a little bit careful in here, as you can see. Don't worry too much if you make a mess. It's not an area that anyone's going to see. So while the timber work is drying, we move on to the metallic parts. We've got the bell, we've got some nails, and we've got some metal fastenings. I painted all of this lead belcher in the first instance. I was tempted to paint the bell brass, but I realised I wanted these details to stand out, and therefore I was going to leave the bell in the lead belcher and allow the coloured metallics to show up on the particular insignia. This is a big smooth surface, so again, be careful when you're applying the paint. You're probably going to need 2 fairly thin coats of this. Don't worry about covering any areas that you're going to paint a different metallic colour later. Having the lead belcher underneath can really help. Other areas that you're going to paint lead belcher are the various metal reinforcements, perhaps the nail heads. You may choose to leave them. There were wooden nails in the past, there were copper nails, you paint them whatever you like. And there's also a couple of rings for attaching ropes or whatever on the front. In the same way as the red brickwork, I felt that the metal nails were worth doing because they added some visual interest to a side of the model that was quite bland. The next step is to add the coloured metallic sections to the bell. I chose to use Retributor armour for the design and the middle of the bell, and I used the Balthazar gold for the lettering around the bottom. The central design is fairly straightforward. As to the lettering, though, if you're not comfortable with a brush, then this may be a step worth skipping. Once you put a wash on this, it will still highlight those areas anyway. It will put a line around them which will help them stand out. But this isn't a bad place to practice. If it doesn't work for you, just get the lead belcher out and paint over it once it's dry. We also painted the skeletons at this point with the Rakarth flesh. This is another area where you need to be quite careful not to get that Rakarth flesh on any of the stonework. Again, use a fairly thin paint so that it applies easily, it moves smoothly off the brush. Watch for areas where, such as the side of the skull and the arms, where it's quite close to the stonework, but it's going to stand out if you don't paint it. Apart from the timber and the stonework, everything else has had a wash of Agragta shade. And you can see on the bell in particular, that's really brought it to life. It still looks a bit grimy, but the features are quite distinctive. Because this is such a prominent piece of scenery within the set, I decided to take one extra step with these, which was the bindings on the skeleton's hands and feet. I did this after the wash because I wanted the colour to be quite light. You can do this whatever colour you want. I actually mixed an orangey brown because that was what I was going for. I did it after the wash so that the colour remained bright, so that they stood out. I felt if I was going to put the time into painting these bindings, which are quite small, then I wanted them to be noticed. So that's our assembled scenery. It took several hours because there are so many pieces. We have another video to come looking at some of the scatter scenery and how that differs. And those were the paints we used. There seems to be a lot of paints there, but there's a lot of different colours on the model and they've all got some highlights. You could have used less paints, you could have used more paints, and you could have painted the timber work however you wanted. That was just the ones that I particularly wanted to use. But it's good enough. There are other things that you could do. You could certainly put a lot more time and detail working with the skeletons. You could certainly put a lot more time in with the stonework. You could have painted the whole thing rather than just stained it. And you could get a very similar result by doing that, and certainly a better one. Some of the details on the statues and the figurines which are on all the pillars in the stonework, that could have been done. And one of the things that I'm still tempted to do is to repaint all of these edging stones around the top of all the walls. I think that the model needs a little bit more for me. I'm tempted to go for black, but I feel it would not contrast strongly enough with the timber work that is also in that area of the model. I'd like to go for red perhaps, or even just a Zandri dust. You experiment with them for different results, see what you like, but that's certainly one of the areas that's worth considering. So the first part of our scenery is done. It's not beautiful, but it is decent. And it is ready, and it isn't going to make your models look naff by being painted better than them. I'm telling you that this model is ready for the table. See you in part 2 to look at the scatter scenery and how we painted those. Thank you for watching.